When the men who would become the Red Tails first stepped onto the hot Alabama tarmac at Tuskegee Army Airfield in 1941, few in the United States Army Air Forces believed they would ever see combat, let alone become the single most reliable bomber escort unit of the entire war. They were trained under a cloud of doubt so thick it seemed engineered to break them before they ever touched a cockpit. Military officials, influenced by racist pseudoscience and decades of segregation, insisted that African Americans lacked the discipline, reflexes, and technical aptitude required to fly advanced fighters. Some officers openly predicted the program would collapse within months. Yet the men who arrived at Tuskegee, many of them college graduates, athletes, mechanics, and engineers, carried something far stronger than the prejudice stacked against them, an unshakable determination to prove every skeptic wrong. Their training regimen reflected both the Army's caution and its quiet fear that failure would validate segregationist beliefs. Tuskegee cadets endured stricter medical exams, longer academic courses, and tougher check flights than white trainees. Instructors like Chief Flight Instructor Charles DeBow and Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a West Point graduate who had survived 4 years of silence and racism at the academy, demanded excellence not simply because it was necessary, but because they knew the entire fate of the program and the future of black aviation rested on each cadet's shoulders. The early aircraft they trained on, the BT-13 Valiant and AT-6 Texan, became symbols of their resolve. Every hour spent in the cockpit was another step toward disproving the War Department's assumptions. One by one, cadets who were expected to fail soared through check rides, formation drills, and gunnery training. Graduation ceremonies at Tuskegee became quiet acts of resistance, a demonstration that skill had no color. By mid-1942, the Army could no longer deny the results. The 99th Fighter Squadron was activated and deployed first, initially flying P-40 Warhawks in North Africa. Their early missions were not glamorous: ground attack sorties, patrol flights, and secondary roles that kept them away from the large-scale air battles raging over Italy and the Mediterranean. Critics back home seized on every minor error, weaponizing it as proof that the experiment should be shut down. But the pilots who would later form the core of the 332nd Fighter Group, men like Lee Archer, Roscoe Brown, Charles A. Train Anderson, and Clarence Lucky Lester, ignored the noise. They flew their assignments with methodical precision, surviving encounters that would have broken less disciplined squadrons. Everything changed in October 1943 when the Army reorganized African American aviation units into the newly formed 332nd Fighter Group, stationed at Ramatelli Airfield in Italy. Now operating under the 15th Air Force, they prepared for a mission unlike anything they had handled before, escorting bombers deep into the heart of Germany. But before they could earn that mission, they had to prove themselves all over again. Their early aircraft they trained on, the P-13 Airacobra and later P-47 Thunderbolts, were rugged but lacked the high-altitude performance needed to defend B-17s and B-24s from Luftwaffe interceptors. Yet the men of the 332nd treated every sortie as if the world were watching. They built a reputation for discipline, cohesion, and reliability, traits the bomber crews desperately needed after suffering catastrophic losses in 1943. By early 1944, the transition to the sleek, long-range P-51C Mustang transformed the group. The red-painted tails, originally just a squadron identifier, became their signature. At last, the Tuskegee Airmen had a fighter worthy of their skill. But they also inherited the war's most demanding air combat job: protect bombers on 500 to 1,000-mile missions deep into Germany, where Bf-109s FW-190s, and eventually Me-262 jets prowled for vulnerable heavy bombers. Other escort groups had developed the reputation, fair or not, of leaving their bombers to chase German fighters for personal glory and kill credits. The 15th Air Force leadership made it clear the 332nd would be judged not on kills, but on how many bombers returned home. With that mandate, the Red Tails embraced a doctrine that would shock the Luftwaffe and earn them the eternal respect of bomber crews. Never leave the bombers. No matter how tempting the chase, no matter how many kills they could tally, their duty was to stay with the formation at all times. It was a doctrine rooted in discipline, forged from prejudice, and sharpened by the knowledge that any mistake would be used to discredit their entire unit. While still on the ground at Ramatelli, bomber crews from the 5th, 47th, and 49th Bomb Wings whispered skepticism. Could these new pilots, black pilots, untested in the deepest reaches of Germany's defenses, really protect them from the elite fighters of Jagdgeschwader 27 or GG-53? But when the 332nd launched their first long-range escort missions in early 1944, the skeptics fell silent. The Red Tails flew in tight, unwavering screens around the bombers, turning every attack run from the Luftwaffe into a deadly risk. The stage was set for a transformation no one had expected. The most doubted pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces were about to become their most trusted guardians. Their legend and their unmatched escort record would be written in the skies over Ploesti, Vienna, Munich, and Berlin. When the 332nd Fighter Group arrived in Italy in early 1944, the Allied bomber offensive was hanging by a thread. Every long-range strike deep into the Third Reich came at a staggering cost. Over the previous year, Luftwaffe interceptors had torn into bomber formations with brutal efficiency, using coordinated head-on attacks, heavy cannon fire, and swarm tactics that overwhelmed American escorts. Many fighter groups, eager to score kills and gain personal glory, routinely chased enemy fighters far from the formations they were meant to protect. Each time they did, the bombers paid the price. B-17s and B-24s returned to base riddled with holes, if they returned at all. In the briefing rooms of the 15th Air Force, bomber crews spoke openly about which escort groups they trusted and which ones they prayed to avoid. Into this crisis stepped the 332nd Fighter Group, young, ambitious, and fully aware that the Army was watching their every move. For years, they had been judged by a different standard, doubted not for their flying, but for their race. Now they faced a mission where failure could doom thousands of bomber crewmen and confirm every racist expectation. But instead of bending under that pressure, the Red Tails transformed it into a razor-sharp purpose. They embraced a doctrine that was radical in its simplicity. The bomber comes first. From Ramatelli Airfield, their P-51C Mustangs, sleek, long-legged, and freshly painted with the distinctive crimson tail, formed up around massive bomber formations rising from Italy toward the Alps. These were not simple escort tasks. Missions often required 6 to 8 hours of flight, weaving through flak corridors, climbing above 25,000 feet, and facing waves of Bf-109 G6s, FW-190A8s, and even twin-engine Zerstörer heavy fighters designed specifically to destroy bombers. While many escort groups broke away at the first sign of a German fighter, the Red Tails held tight. They stayed welded to the bomber stream, maintaining perfect spacing, altitude discipline, and radio control. Luftwaffe pilots diving in for the kill discovered that the Mustangs around the bombers did not scatter or chase. They pivoted as a single shield. The German tactic of drawing escorts away simply did not work. The 332nd refused to be baited. This unwavering discipline startled both sides. At first, bomber crews doubted what they were seeing. In early missions over Romania and Austria, B-24 crews from the 304th and 454th Bomb Groups looked out their waist gun windows and saw the red tails holding formation, mile after mile, never drifting, never abandoning them for a personal score. After years of being left exposed by escort units that chased kills, the steadiness of the red tails felt unreal. Gunner diaries and mission logs from the period often contain the same phrase, "They never left us." The Red Tails' radio discipline became legendary. They did not clutter communication channels with chatter. They called contacts clearly, maneuvered smoothly, and rotated positions to avoid fatigue. The bomber crews began sending messages back down the line. "We want the boys with the red tails." Requests like that were unheard of in an army still deeply segregated, and they spread quickly. Even Luftwaffe pilots noticed. Jagdgeschwader 27 and JG-53 pilots reported that the Schwarze Piloten mit roten Heckleitwerken, or black pilots with red tail surfaces, were unusually difficult to lure away from bombers. The tactic of feinting to draw off escorts, a mainstay of German interception strategy, failed completely. The red tails stayed glued to the defensive box regardless of what the enemy did. What made their discipline even more extraordinary was that the Tuskegee Airmen were hungry to prove themselves. Every pilot in the 332nd knew that kills meant prestige and advancement. Yet they also understood a deeper truth. Their unit would be judged not on their victory tally, but on how many bombers could return home because of them. Each time they ignored a tempting chase and maintained position on the bombers, they reinforced a reputation that would soon reshape the strategic air war. Their first major demonstration came during escort missions to Anzio, Ploiești, and Budapest. Over heavily defended targets, oil refineries, aircraft factories, and rail yards, the Luftwaffe threw everything it had. FW-190s dived through the bomber streams firing rockets. Bf-109s made head-on passes with 30mm Mk-108 cannons capable of ripping a B-17 in half. Yet the Red Tails fought them off again and again, not by chasing, but by forming an impenetrable bubble of protection. On these missions, their philosophy paid immediate dividends. While bomber losses across the Mediterranean were still significant, the loss rate on missions escorted by the 332nd dropped dramatically. Commanders noticed, crews noticed, even German interrogation reports from captured Luftwaffe pilots noted that the red-hooked Mustangs, their term for the Red Tails, guarded the bombers with unusual stubbornness. As the months passed, the Red Tails' approach hardened into doctrine. It became part of their identity, more binding than race, more defining than the paint on their aircraft. They were no longer simply a fighter group. They were the bomber's shield. And that purpose, forged through discipline and sharpened by prejudice, would carry them into the battles where they would make history. Berlin, Munich, Linz, and the skies over the Danube, where German pilots realized these new escorts were unlike anything they had faced before. The 332nd had not yet set their record. They had not yet earned the title of the best escort group of the war. But by early 1944, one thing was already clear. In a sky filled with danger, the Red Tails were the only escort unit that bomber crews trusted with their lives. By the summer of 1944, the Red Tails had become more than an escort group. They had become a myth whispered across bomber squadrons and discussed with growing frustration inside Luftwaffe ready rooms. The German fighter pilots, who had built their reputations shredding American bomber formations, now found themselves confronting an escort screen unlike anything they had faced before. The 332nd Fighter Group did not behave like their counterparts. They did not scatter. They did not lose cohesion. They did not chase easy kills. They existed for one purpose alone: keep the bombers alive. And once the major air battles of 1944 erupted across Eastern Europe, Austria, Romania, and the southern German industrial belt, that purpose turned into a force that shocked every German pilot who tried to break them. The first defining moment came on June 9, 1944, when the Red Tails escorted bombers deep into enemy airspace toward Munich and Politz. The Luftwaffe, already strained by months of attrition, threw Bf-109Gs and Fw-190As into the path of the 15th Air Force bombers. Their intent was classic German doctrine: launch head-on attacks to break up the bomber boxes, then circle around to pick off crippled stragglers before the escorts could regroup. Except with the Red Tails, the escorts never left the boxes. When the first wave of German fighters dived toward the leading B-24 formation, the 332nd pivoted as a cohesive wall, forming what bomber crews later described as a moving shield with red-painted edges. The Germans expected the Mustangs to pursue the fleeing attackers, but the Red Tails stayed put, preserving the integrity of the defensive rings around the bombers. Several Luftwaffe pilots, stunned by the escort discipline, abandoned their planned second attacks entirely. For them, the realization dawned quickly: the normal playbook didn't work here. But the most famous moment came on March 24, 1945, during the Berlin mission, one of the most dangerous operations of the entire air war. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s headed toward the Berlin capital to strike rail yards and industrial targets. Berlin was still defended by hardened veterans from Jagdgeschwader 3, Udet, JG-4, JG-300, and remnants of JG-7, which operated the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-262. Escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back required discipline, range, and nerves of steel, qualities the 332nd had built their reputation on. What happened next became legend. As German jets soared in for slashing attacks on the bomber streams, the Red Tails positioned themselves to intercept. Captain Roscoe Brown, flying a P-51D, spotted a formation of Me-262s preparing to strike and dove on them with impossible precision. In a move that defied conventional wisdom, propeller-driven fighters weren't supposed to catch jets. Brown and his wingman closed in as the jets slowed during their approach. Brown fired a burst that ripped into the engine of one Me-262, sending it spiraling into the German countryside. This victory, along with kills by pilots like Charles Brantley and Earl Lane, sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. Losing an Me-262, Hitler's much-hyped wonder weapon, to a black fighter pilot was a psychological blow none of them forgot. But it wasn't just their encounters with jets that defined the Red Tails' growing legend. Throughout missions over Budapest, Vienna, Linz, Brux, and Ploiești, the Luftwaffe repeatedly attempted to tear open bomber formations using massed Fw-190 and Bf-109 attacks. Each time, the Red Tails met them with ferocious resistance. They pioneered escort formations that kept bombers covered from all angles. They rotated flights through choke points at the edges of the box. Their radio discipline was flawless, allowing them to shift positions instantly without confusion or wasted motion. German pilots soon began noting something unnerving. The Red Tails seemed to appear whenever the bombers were most vulnerable, whenever a formation lagged, whenever a straggler drifted out of position, whenever German fighters attempted to isolate a crippled B-17 or B-24, a red-tailed Mustang would inevitably swoop in to intervene. Bomber crews later reported moments when they believed they were doomed, only to see a red flash streak past their cockpit window, followed by the explosion of a pursuing Bf-109. One bomber tail gunner wrote in his diary, "They were like guardian angels. They stayed with us even when everyone else broke off." That line echoed through dozens of mission reports. The Luftwaffe's growing frustration was captured in interrogation transcripts from German pilots. They complained that the Schwarze Mustangs, black-flown Mustangs, refused every feint and bait tactic. They could not be drawn away. They flew with unnatural discipline. They were a barrier of red tails we could not penetrate. By late 1944, whenever bomber crews were briefed for a deep strike, they asked the same question: "Are the red tails with us?" When the answer was yes, a wave of relief passed through the room. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe morale sank. JG-27, JG-53, and JG-301 pilots reported that escort groups normally broke apart under pressure, but not the red tails. Their refusal to chase kills created an escort pattern the Germans had not expected and could not counter. Through the battles of summer 1944 and early 1945, the Red Tails proved over and over that their discipline was not a slogan, it was a weapon. Evolving from suspicion and racism to battlefield dominance, they had become the one escort group the Luftwaffe could neither outfly nor outthink. The air battles of 1944 to 1945 did not just showcase their skill, they broke the enemy's confidence completely.
By the end of 1944, bomber crews across Italy, the Balkans, and southern Germany had reached a unanimous conclusion. If the Red Tails were overhead, survival chances tripled. This wasn't exaggeration. It wasn't wartime rumor or morale boosting. It was mathematics, cold, undeniable, written into the mission reports of the 15th Air Force. In 179 bomber escort missions, the 332nd Fighter Group lost only 27 bombers. No other escort group in the Mediterranean or European theater matched a record remotely close. And the more deeply historians studied the air war, the more astonishing this number became. The 15th Air Force regularly lost dozens of bombers per month to flak, weather, and enemy interceptors. Across 1943 and early 1944, certain missions, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Vienna Neustadt, had nearly wiped out entire bomb wings. Escort groups faced impossible odds, and every unit had bad days, except the Red Tails. Their record was the product of an almost impossible combination of discipline, skill, tactical innovation, and a singular focus on mission purpose. Unlike many fighter units, which judge success by victory credits, the 332nd defined success by a single question: how many bombers came home? Their commanders drilled it into every pilot. A kill meant nothing if one bomber was lost. If a B-24 went down because a Mustang left the formation in pursuit of glory, that kill was worthless. This philosophy was not just moral, it was tactical genius. Luftwaffe doctrine relied heavily on drawing escorts away from bomber streams. German fighters would dive in aggressively, then break away at high speed, hoping the American escorts would bite and chase them. The moment they peeled off, other German fighters swarmed the now unprotected bombers. Most escort groups, staffed by aggressive dogfighters eager to prove themselves, fell for the trap repeatedly. But the Red Tails didn't. They held formation every single time. When BF-109Gs or FW-190As dove across the bomber nose, the Red Tails responded with measured, precise moves, not pursuit. They positioned themselves to block follow-up attacks, not chase the attackers. This frustrated the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces. Pilots from JG-53 and JG-27 reported that the red-tailed Mustangs behaved in ways they had never seen from escort groups. One German pilot complained in an interrogation report, "They do not behave like the others. They refuse the bait." And because they refused the bait, their bomber losses stayed near zero. One of the clearest demonstrations of their effectiveness came during the massive escort missions to Romania's oil fields. Ploiești had some of the densest flak and fighter defenses in Europe. Luftwaffe units from JG-52 and JG-53 waited at high altitude for straggling bombers. The Red Tails, flying their P-51Cs and P-51Ds, formed tight, rotating screens around the bomber boxes. Even when flak bursts forced bombers to scatter, the Red Tails reformed instantly, covering damaged aircraft and guiding them home. In multiple escort missions to Vienna, Munich, and Linz, they repeated this pattern. Their kill tally grew, but only insofar as it protected the bombers. They claimed dozens of enemy aircraft in these battles, yet their bomber losses stayed shockingly low. The strict discipline that once seemed restrictive became a lethal advantage. Yet the numbers only tell part of the story. What truly cemented their legend was how bomber crews felt about them. Diaries, letters home, and mission logs are filled with praise. Those red-tailed fighters never left us. I'd fly anywhere with them. Best damned escort in the Army Air Forces. Many bomber crews believed the Red Tails had supernatural timing. Every time a B-17 or B-24 was damaged and began to lag behind the formation, a prime target for Luftwaffe hunters, a red-tailed Mustang appeared beside it. These weren't coincidence or luck. The 332nd prioritized falling behind and crippled bombers, knowing that's where the Luftwaffe struck hardest. Bomber crews clinging to life in frozen, bullet-torn airframes watched as Tuskegee pilots flew so close they could see the pilots' faces. Sometimes the Mustangs rocked their wings in reassurance, a silent promise that the bomber was not alone. This bond was emotional as much as tactical. The bomber crews didn't just respect the Red Tails, they trusted them. In a segregated army where many white servicemen had never interacted with African Americans outside of limited roles, the Red Tails shattered stereotypes every time they escorted a bomber home. Their legacy grew even larger in early 1945 when they achieved a rare feat, shooting down German jets. Me-262s were meant to be unstoppable, slashing through bomber streams at 540 miles per hour. Yet the Red Tails learned how to exploit the jet's vulnerability, its slow acceleration during landing and takeoff. On March 24, 1945, during the Berlin mission, pilots like Roscoe Brown, Charles Brantley, and Earl Lane attacked Me-262s as they lined up for landing. Brown shot one down, an extraordinary achievement for a propeller-driven fighter. Despite these kills, their bomber loss record remained their proudest accomplishment. While other escort groups lost dozens, sometimes hundreds of bombers across the war, the Red Tails lost just 27 in 179 missions, a number so low that for decades people assumed it must be myth. But the records are there, carefully kept by the 15th Air Force, and they show that the most doubted fighter group in U.S. history became the best protector of American bomber crews, trusted above all others. In the cold reality of statistics and the warm loyalty of the men they saved, no escort group in World War II earned a stronger reputation or a greater legacy.
By the spring of 1945, as the European war neared its end, the Red Tails had already carved their legend into the skies. What began as an experiment, one many commanders expected to fail, had become the most respected escort force in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. But the true measure of their achievement wasn't just written in mission logs or kill credits. It lived in the stunned reactions of the Luftwaffe, the grateful testimonies of bomber crews, and the irreversible change they brought to the American military itself. The German pilots who survived encounters with the Red Tails rarely forgot them. In interrogation reports collected by Allied intelligence, Luftwaffe pilots repeatedly remarked that the red-tailed Mustangs were unlike any escort group they had ever faced. They described their discipline as inhuman, their cohesion as unbreakable, and their refusal to be drawn away from bombers as confounding. One German officer, captured near Linz, summed up the sentiment perfectly. They guarded the bombers like they were made of gold. For the Luftwaffe, this was not merely frustration. It was a sign that their tactics, honed over half a decade of war, were being undone by a fighter group that had rewritten what an escort force could be. German fighters relied on exploiting escort mistakes. They needed escorts to chase. They needed chaos. But the Red Tails gave them nothing. Every time they approached the bomber stream, they found a wall of Mustangs flying with the precision of a machine. This psychological impact mattered. By late 1944, Germany had lost many of its experienced pilots, and the new ones entering combat had little time to train. To these young German flyers, seeing the red-painted tail meant that their odds of breaking through to the bombers had just dropped to nearly zero. It was a demoralizing sight in a war where morale was already collapsing. But while the Luftwaffe wrestled with the Red Tail's unexpected mastery, the bomber crews experienced the same phenomenon from the opposite perspective. For them, the appearance of the Red Tails in the distance, rising out of the haze as the formation approached its target, brought a surge of confidence no other escort group had ever inspired. Flying a bomber was a brutal, freezing, terrifying job. Flak bursts rocked the aircraft. Cannon shells from FW-190s ripped through wings, and gunners often watched their friends disappear in explosions of smoke and fire. But whenever the Red Tails were present, bomber crews felt something they couldn't fully explain: safety. They wrote about it in journals. They told their families in letters home. They kept the stories alive for decades. During reunions long after the war, Mustang pilots and bomber veterans embraced like brothers, even when they had never met before, because both understood what the red-painted tail had meant. It meant survival. The 332nd Fighter Group never asked for recognition during the war. They didn't receive it either, not from the Army, not from many commanders, and certainly not from a country still divided by segregation. But their effectiveness forced the military to confront a reality it had spent generations ignoring. Talent was not limited by race. The success of the Red Tails cut straight through the myth that African Americans were unfit for combat aviation. Every bomber saved, every escort mission completed, every aircraft returned home was another crack in the walls of prejudice that had shaped U.S. military policy. When the war ended in 1945, the Air Force documented the Red Tails' performance with clinical precision. Their record, only 27 bombers lost in 179 missions, became a statistical monument, unbeatable by any other escort group in Europe. But the numbers only hinted at the deeper transformation they had ignited. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces. Historians agree on one thing: without the success of the 332nd Fighter Group, that order might have taken another decade to arrive. The Red Tails had proven on the largest stage in the world that segregation was not only unjust, it was strategically foolish. Beyond military policy, their legacy shaped aviation itself. Many former Red Tails became flight instructors, commercial pilots, engineers, or commanders in the post-war Air Force. Their example inspired generations of black aviators and set a precedent for excellence that echoed into the jet age, the space race, and even NASA. Their impact also extended across the Atlantic. When captured German pilots learned after the war that the disciplined Mustang unit had been composed entirely of black Americans, men their own society would have dismissed, they were stunned. Many admitted that they had assumed the Red Tails were elite volunteers selected from the best white American units. They had no idea the men who had frustrated them again and again had been fighting two battles simultaneously, one against the Luftwaffe and one against their own country's prejudice. Today, the image of the P-51 Mustang with red painted tail surfaces remains one of the most iconic symbols of World War II aviation. Museums, documentaries, and films have immortalized their accomplishments. But the true legacy of the Red Tails is not in Hollywood dramatization. It is in the bomber crews who survived because of them, in the change they forced upon the U.S. military, and in the way they transformed the very definition of courage and professionalism. The Luftwaffe feared them, the bomber crews trusted them, and history remembers them. The Tuskegee Airmen began the war doubted, restricted, and underestimated. They ended it as the finest bomber escort group in the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. Guardians whose red tails became a promise. As long as we are here, you will make it home.